Few companies have ever fallen from grace as badly as Konami has. Everything that's left of that company now is a soulless, ghoulish husk that feeds off the hopes and dreams of gamers. But it's easy to forget now, it wasn't always like that. Before Konami turned into this vampiric being themselves, they used to make really excellent games about vampires. I'd rank the Castlevania series as one of my favorite franchises of all time. Outside the ones created by Nintendo, I might even consider it my absolute favorite. But sadly, now it's been over 6 years since the last Castlevania game released. And no, get out of here, Lords of Shadow. God of War with fancy hair doesn't count as Castlevania. Well, anyway, as fans, I think it's best we all accept that we might never get to experience a new Castlevania game the way we used to again. At least not until Konami finally gives up and lets someone who actually cares about the franchise have it instead. It's a good thing then that the franchise has such a rich history that it's always worth going back to explore the past games. And today we'll be taking a look at a sub-series within the Castlevania series. A sub-series that in many ways defined the future of the entire franchise. These games were known as the Dracula X games. And while you might be disappointed to hear that they didn't have any snowboarding vampires in them, what we did get was even more awesome. The first of these games was Castlevania Dracula X Rondo of Blood for the TurboGrafx 16, or as it's known in Japan, the PC Engine. This game was not very well known outside of Japan, and it's pretty easy to explain why. First of all, while the PC Engine was very popular in Japan, the American and European TurboGrafx was not a very big seller. But owning this obscure system wasn't enough. You also needed the optional and even more obscure CD attachment. But even that wasn't enough. You also needed the Super System card, which from what I understand you couldn't buy in normal game stores but had to mail order from the developers themselves. And if you had all of this, then you could play the game. That is, if you actually knew that it existed. The game was only ever released in Japan, so even though the TurboGrafx CD was region-free, you still had to find out that the game existed and find a way to import it from Japan if you were going to play it. Needless to say, most Western players didn't. I sure wish I was among the ones who did though, cause my god, this game is beyond amazing. You play as Richter Belmont, a descendant of good old Simon from the previous games. And true to the family name, you're once again out to rid the world of Count Dracula. And maybe save a few damsels in distress, including your girlfriend while you're at it. The core gameplay sticks very true to the classic NES Castlevania games. You can jump of course, and you can attack straight ahead using either your whip or your selected sub-weapon. But you don't get the fancy free whip control that you had in Super Castlevania 4, which came out a couple of years earlier. Now, the controls in Castlevania 4 were actually really awesome and worked superbly for that game. But if I'm being totally honest, I actually prefer the more simplistic controls of this game. And there are actually a couple of new, more advanced moves you can use. Firstly, there's a backward somersault you can perform by double tapping the jump button. It's a bit harder to time than a normal jump, but it can be very valuable if you need to quickly escape an enemy attack. Then there's also a new offensive ability called the Item Crush. By pressing the select button you perform a super powerful version of your current sub-weapon's attack. This will instantly kill most normal enemies and cause heavy damage to bosses. However, while most normal sub-weapons attacks only use 1 heart point, using an Item Crush will cost 20, so it's something that needs to be used very sparingly. But what really places this game above the previous games in the series are two things: the scope and the presentation. While it doesn't have a huge open world like most of the later games, this is still a really massive game. While the levels are somewhat linear, all of them have at least a couple of different paths you can explore, and most of them even have alternate hidden boss battles, which in turn will also unlock totally different levels than the standard boss battles. And then there's also the kidnapped girls I mentioned earlier. There's 4 of them in total, and trying to find them all is one of the trickier parts of the game. However, you'll need to find them all if you want to unlock the best ending of the game. But by far the most interesting part of this subquest is Maria, the first girl that you can rescue. Once you've saved her, she actually becomes a new playable character. And it's not just a simple sprite swap either. Both her weapons and her movesets are very different from Richter's. Instead of Richter's backward somersault, Maria has the ability to perform a double jump. In addition to that, she can also slide along the ground, which is very helpful for evading enemy attacks. And it can also be used to get through tight passageways that Richter can't access. And then there's her attacks, which mainly consists of throwing various magical animals. Her main attack is throwing a dove that will fly forward and then return to her like a boomerang. This attack is not only faster than Richter's whip, but she can also throw 2 of them at once. So since Maria is both more powerful and more maneuverable than Richter, you could almost consider her the game's easy mode. But no matter who you play as, don't expect the game to be a cakewalk. You'll still get more than enough of the old Castlevania challenge. And then there's that other really great thing I was going to talk about. Oh yeah, that's right, the presentation. Or as it should more accurately be referred to, the unbelievable, mind-blowing presentation. In my opinion, this game crowned Castlevania as the king of pixel art, and the only other series that have ever even come close to dethroning it since then is the Metal Slug series. And anything that can be measured favorably against Metal Slug just has to be awesome, right? Yeah, awesome sounds like about the right word to describe it. But not awesome like in hahaha this cat video my friend posted on Facebook is awesome. More like the awesome power of the cosmos ripping a hole in the fabric of reality and bestowing a miracle upon the lowly peons of the land. Well, you know, as long as that miracle could fit on a compact disc. And speaking about that CD, you know, everything about this game looks amazing. The characters, the enemies, the backgrounds. But the thing that really sells it is the variety. And that was only made possible thanks to the CD format. The amount of different environments and enemy types in this game is nothing short of mind-blowing, especially by 1992 standards. Don't get me wrong now, the older Castlevania games also had a great deal of variety, but in this game it feels like you can barely make the screen scroll without coming across a new meticulously detailed enemy sprite. And on top of all this you also get anime-style cutscenes at key parts in the game. Now, they're not exactly heavily animated and there's not a ton of them in the game, but they're still pretty impressive for the time. And of course they are also fully voice acted, albeit only in Japanese since the game was only released in Japan. Now, the CD technology was awesome for getting all this extra stuff into the game, but of course there is that other thing about CDs. Yeah, that thing they were created for to begin with. That's right, music. Now, there has never been a Castlevania game with bad music. No, get out of here, Lords of Shadow, you still don't count. Now, as I was saying, all the Castlevania games have good music, but this was the first time we get the chance to hear it in CD quality, and oh boy was it great. Not only did you get CD quality versions of some of the most iconic songs from the NES games, but many of the original tracks in this game also went on to become classics in their own right. It's really a big shame that most Western players never got the chance to experience this game when it first came out. Luckily though, it's a lot easier to do so these days. You could of course buy the original game off eBay. It's pretty expensive though, but luckily there are other options now. You can get the completely unaltered PC Engine version from the Wii Virtual Console for less than $10. There's also another option, but we'll get to that one later in this video. For now, let's take a look at something that Western players did get back in the 90s. We may not have gotten the original PC Engine version of Dracula X, but we did get a game named Castlevania Dracula X. Or, you know, the Americans did at least. Here in Europe it was called Castlevania Vampire's Kiss. But whatever you want to call it, it was kind of a Super Nintendo reimagining of the original PC Engine game. I've heard some people refer to this as a watered down and inferior port of the PC Engine game. But that's not really true. Well, okay, you can't really deny that it's not as good as the PC Engine version. But the fact of the matter is that this is not a port. Sure, it has the same basic story and it does reuse some elements from the PC Engine game, but I'd say something like 90% of the game is completely new. But let's start with something that has remained mostly unchanged, and that is the basic gameplay. It's still a classic linear Castlevania game, and apart from the obvious difference in the controller itself, it controls pretty much exactly like the PC Engine version. And like in the original, you can also find alternate paths in some of the levels, though it has been reduced from 4 alternate stages to only 2. And the same is true for the kidnapped girls. The original had 4 hidden damsels in distress to rescue, but this time it's again reduced to only 2. But the most disappointing part about this is that even though Maria is still one of the girls in the game, you don't get to play as her this time, and that's a big hit to the gameplay variety. And also, since this game doesn't let you jump back and forth freely between levels, you actually have to go on a very specific path if you want to get the best ending. So that's a bit disappointing as well. But now let's have a look at the things that really set this game apart from the original PC Engine version. Well, first of all, the level designs are completely different from the original. And I do mean completely. Sure, some stages have a couple of slightly similar sections, but for the most part it might as well be a completely new game. Most people will actually agree that the levels in this version are a bit harder, and the original was already pretty challenging to begin with. Whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing is up to you, but I actually quite like the extra challenge. Along with this, the background graphics have also been completely remade. They're a lot more colorful this time, and they actually remind me a bit of the PC Engine version's anime cutscenes. The sprites are mostly lifted from the PC Engine, but with a few small changes to account for the different art style and hardware, though there are a few completely original anime sprites too. From a purely technical standpoint, you could actually argue that this game looks better than the original. But the thing that this game could never live up to is the pure variety and attention to detail that the CD-ROM technology allowed for. So as much as I love the Super Nintendo, the point definitely goes to the PC Engine. And the same can be said for the sound too. The SNES sound chip does put up a good fight, but it just can't compare to the CD quality of the PC Engine version. And when you add in that one had a bigger soundtrack and voice acting to boot, well, the fight was over before it began, really. You shouldn't let this deter you from playing the game though. As I said before, this is more of a reimagining that only uses certain elements of the original PC Engine version. And if you judge it on its own merits, it's just as fun and playable as the other old school Castlevania games. While neither version of the original Castlevania X received as much attention as the other games in the series, they're still fondly remembered cult classics today. But if these games are cult classics, then the next one is more of a cult phenomenon. Yep, this is the game that changed the game. The game that turned Castlevania from simple platformers to huge open-world adventures. You guessed it, it's time for the one and the only Castlevania Symphony of the Night. This game is a direct sequel to Rondo of Blood. It even begins with a recreation of the final battle from that game. But even if you never played Symphony of the Night, you probably already knew this, since this scene has pretty much become more famous than the game itself.
Die, monster! You don't belong in this world!
Yeah, this was before the games industry figured out that whole voice acting thing. But hey, at least it wasn't as bad as what Sega was doing. But while Symphony of the Night isn't going to win any prizes for the voice acting, holy crap the rest of the game. You play the main game as Alucard, the son of Dracula, who had previously been playable in Castlevania 3 on the NES, though he seems to have entered his goth phase at this point. Take notes on this, Lords of Shadow, this is how you do vampires with fabulous hair. Your goal, like always in these games, is to defeat Count Dracula. However, you also need to find Richard Belmont, who has disappeared somewhere inside the castle. But this time it's not as simple as just going through stages. No, this is the game where the series went from just Vania to the now famous Metroidvania. Castlevania had attempted an open-world exploration game before with Simon's Quest, but while I did like that game, this was the first time where they really got it right. Even though the entire game takes place inside the castle, the map is absolutely massive, and contrary to what you might believe after hearing that, there's no lack of variety either. You get libraries, dungeons, chapels, pretty much anything you could imagine inside a castle, and all of it done with a wonderful attention to detail. Of course, an open world isn't worth much if there's nothing worth exploring in it. Ubisoft. But thankfully, Symphony of the Night has that part covered as well. There's of course weapons and equipment to find to increase Alucard's stats, but the coolest stuff is all the special abilities you can find. Some of these, like the double jump and the ability to transform into a bat, are required to beat the game, but there's also a whole bunch of them that are completely optional. This includes familiars, which are small monsters that fly around and help you in different ways, and also magic attacks, which are performed by entering different button combinations, similar to a special move in a fighting game. Now, if we take a look at the very core of the gameplay, then it's both very similar and very different to the older games. Your movement is a bit more fast and free, but overall controls and feel is still very much Castlevania. And even though your main weapon this time is a sword instead of a whip, the timing of your attacks will still be very familiar if you played any of the older games. And another similarity is the way you have to observe the enemy's movement and attack patterns. In fact, a lot of the enemies are actually straight up copy-pasted from the original Rondo of Blood. Don't take that as a criticism though. The original enemies were fantastically well made and more than worthy of being used again. And besides, there's almost 100 totally new enemies created just for this game. However, there is one thing that's really different about Symphony of the Night compared to the older games. You know, besides the obvious with the open world setup and all. And that is that the game is not very hard. Now don't get me wrong, it's not a cakewalk either, but a lot of the older games were really brutal, and this one really is not. You get a lot more health than in any previous Castlevania game, and if that's not enough you can always just buy a bunch of healing items or grind a few levels. Again, I need to stress that this is not a criticism, but it is something that makes the game different for those who are used to the older games in the series, though I will say that it was probably a good choice for the more exploration-focused gameplay. Now let's move on to the graphics. I said that Rondo of Blood crowned Castlevania as the king of pixel art, and if that's true then Symphony of the Night is definitely one of the most brilliant jewels in that crown. I already mentioned that the enemies and environments are even more varied this time, and they're also even more detailed if you can believe that. Many of the sprites, especially Alucard himself and the bosses, almost border on obsessive amounts of detail. And the backgrounds are almost equally gorgeous, often featuring moving elements and or multiple layers of parallax scrolling. I know it's hard to believe, but when this game came out there were actually a bit of backlash against the graphics. At that point in time 3D graphics were new and exciting, so there were a lot of people who didn't understand why Konami would want to go back and use smelly old 2D graphics again. Well, joke's on them, because between 2D and 3D games from the 32-bit generation, I don't think anyone can deny which ones held up the best. Or I don't know, maybe you prefer the graphics in Castlevania 64. But one thing I could never see anyone complain about though is the soundtrack. Symphony of the Night has without a doubt one of the best video game soundtracks of all time, and that's not a statement to be taken lightly. However, the music is very different from what Castlevania fans at the time were used to. The music in the series had always had a gothic sound to it, but it also had a lot of metal influences as well. However, this time the gothic sound really took the center stage. You do get a couple of more guitar-heavy tracks, but the majority have a much more classical feel to them. I'm actually kind of split on which style I prefer, but either way there's absolutely no denying that the music is beautifully composed and fits very well with the game. Symphony of the Night really offers almost endless entertainment for the player. Aside from everything I already mentioned, there's of course the inverted castle, or as it's also known, the least well-guarded secret in gaming history. If you collect a specific item in the game, you can access an upside-down version of the castle. This includes new enemies, new bosses, new music and new story, and it almost doubles the game's playtime. And if all that wasn't enough, you can also unlock the ability to play through the entire game as Richter, which actually completely changes how you play. In Japan there was also a version of the game for the Sega Saturn, which, believe it or not, had even more content. This included new enemies, new music and new areas, and also once again the ability to play as Maria. Though the Saturn version is also known for having some performance issues not present in the PlayStation original, and it was also missing some graphical effects compared to the PlayStation. An original copy of Symphony of the Night is pretty expensive today, but as luck would have it you can download it for less than $10 on both PlayStation and Xbox. But keep in mind that the Xbox version is missing the admittedly crappy and unimportant CGI sequences, just in case you care about that. For a long time it seemed like the Dracula X sub-series ended with Symphony of the Night, but then all of a sudden 10 years later, much like Dracula himself, the series was resurrected. This time on the PSP with Castlevania the Dracula X Chronicles. The main feature of Dracula X Chronicles is a complete 3D remake of Rondo of Blood. Well, at least that's what Konami wanted you to think was the main feature, but we'll get back to that soon enough. This game was released before the original PC Engine version came out on Virtual Console, so for many Western players, and I'd guess many players in Japan as well, this was their first chance to play this almost mythical game. And as far as first impressions go, this is pretty good, I guess. Alright, if we start with the positives, then the gameplay is almost identical to the original. It's not a complete one-to-one remake, but it is very close, so that's good. You still have the exact same moveset, and you still have the ability to play as Maria. They also added a bunch of extra hidden items in the forms of CDs which unlock new songs in the sound test options. Not a huge thing by any means, but a fun little extra to encourage exploration. The songs on the soundtrack are mostly the same as the original, but they have all been remixed, and there are some completely new songs as well. I'm not going to say that the music sounds better than the original, but it is really good. And I am glad that they put in the effort to remix the soundtrack instead of just copying it. And since this game was actually released in the West, you also get English voice acting for the first time. Though instead of the anime sequences from the original, you get in-game cutscenes here instead. It's not really a big problem, but it's a little bit disappointing when you look at the great anime sequences in some other PSP games. But there is one thing about this game that is undeniably worse than the original, And as you probably guessed, that's the graphics. Now by PSP standards, these are actually great 3D graphics. And hell, it's commendable that they were even willing to go through the effort of recreating all the content from Rondo of Blood, which I'll remind you was a lot of content. But still, this is going up against one of the best looking 2D games of all time, and it just can't compare. Like I said, these are good graphics by PSP standards, but today they just look kind of desaturated and drab. But it could have always been worse. Still though, this 3D remake is actually pretty fun, but I do recommend that you play the original first. And speaking of the original, remember when I said that Konami wanted you to think that the 3D remake was the main feature of the game? Well, myself and a lot of other people actually bought this game for another reason. That reason being full portable ports of the original Rondo of Blood and Symphony of the Night. Yep, the reason that this game is called the Dracula X Chronicles is that it has the entire Dracula X series in one convenient package. Strangely enough though, you don't have access to the original games to begin with. You have to unlock them by finding hidden items in the 3D game. It is a bit inconvenient, but it's well worth the effort. The Rondo of Blood port is more or less just an emulation of the PC Engine version. However, there is one major difference, and that is English voice acting and text. Sure, you don't actually have to understand the story to enjoy Rondo of Blood, but it is very nice to finally be able to follow it without looking up translations online. But one of the most awesome things about this is that someone actually took the voice files from this game and burned them into an image file from the original PC Engine game, meaning that it's now possible to play the game on the original hardware with an official Konami translation. Now that's what I call a dedicated fanbase. Not that Konami cares about that anymore. Other than the translation though, this is pretty much an exact port of the PC Engine game. Since the original game was in 4:3 aspect ratio, you do get these borders around the screen, but at least it's better than stretching the game. The Symphony of the Night port has actually seen a bit more changes. Most notably, all of the voice acting has been completely re-recorded, using the same voice actors as the 3D Rondo of Blood remake. And while they were at it, they also updated the script to be a little bit less cheesy. It does sound a lot more professional than the original, to be sure, but I actually kind of prefer the old voices. Like the Sega Saturn version, you can also play as Maria this time, though from what I understand she actually plays a bit different here than on the Saturn. Other than that though, this is more or less a faithful port of the PlayStation original. You do get a couple of extra bonus items and such, but nothing major. It is a bit disappointing that they didn't include the bonus content from the Sega Saturn version, but I am happy with what we did get. The two original games really make the Dracula X Chronicles an excellent package, and even though I did complain about it a bit, the 3D version of Rondo of Blood is absolutely worth playing as well. Konami themselves are not what they used to be, and there's a good chance that they never will be again. But the Dracula X series will always live on as some of the best examples of both the classic linear and the modern open-world Castlevania games, and no mobile game or pachinko machine can ever take that away from us.